Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
Two dreams, one love. I still remember the exact moment I realized my husband and I were dreaming different dreams, not the kind you forget when you wake up, but the kind that quietly destroy a marriage if you let them. It was 3 in the morning, and we were lying in bed, staring at the ceiling like two strangers sharing a hotel room. He had just told me about a job opportunity in Texas, a promotion he had been chasing for years, and I had responded with silence. Not because I didn't want to support him, but because I had finally admitted to myself that I couldn't leave California. My dream was here, my students, my community, the life I had built from scratch. His dream was there, the one he had been talking about since before we even got married. And in that dark bedroom, with the city lights flickering through the blinds, I realized we had spent 5 years avoiding this conversation, pretending that love alone would somehow make our different futures magically align. It didn't. Love doesn't erase ambition. It doesn't make you want what someone else wants just because you care about them. If anything, love makes the conflict worse because now you're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting against someone you swore to protect. I sat up in bed, turned to him, and asked the question I had been too scared to ask for years. What if I can't follow you? He didn't answer immediately. He just kept staring at the ceiling, and I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to find a way to solve a problem that didn't have a simple solution. That silence, right there, was louder than any argument we ever had. It was the sound of two people who loved each other but were slowly realizing that love might not be enough. And here's the thing about silence in a marriage, it fills up with resentment, with regret, with all the things you wish you had said but didn't. By the time you finally speak, the silence has already built walls you didn't even notice. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay there, replaying every moment of our relationship, trying to find the exact point where our dreams started to diverge. And I realized it wasn't one moment, it was 1,000 tiny moments, 1,000 small compromises that slowly led us to this impossible choice. The next morning, he left for work without saying goodbye, and I sat at the kitchen table with cold coffee and a terrifying thought. Maybe different dreams don't just test love, maybe they break it. But I wasn't ready to give up yet. Not without a fight. Not without one last attempt to save us. The engineer who hated numbers. Let me tell you about the first time I met my husband. I thought he was the most arrogant, infuriating, wonderful person I had ever encountered. It was a Tuesday afternoon at a coffee shop in downtown Seattle, and he was sitting at the table next to mine, absolutely obliterating a napkin with mathematical equations that looked like they belonged on a NASA whiteboard. I was supposed to be studying for my English teaching certification exam, but I couldn't stop staring at his hands, the way they moved with such confidence, such certainty, as if every number had a place and every equation had an answer. And then he looked up, caught me staring, and said something that made me want to disappear. You look like you have no idea what any of this means. I wanted to be offended. I wanted to tell him that I was perfectly intelligent, thank you very much, and that I didn't need to understand quantum physics to be a good English teacher. But instead, I laughed. Not a polite, controlled laugh, The kind of laugh that comes from someone who has been caught red-handed and knows it. I admitted I had no idea what he was doing, and that's when he told me he was an engineer who hated numbers. He said it like it was the most natural thing in the world, an engineer who hated his own tools. A man who had built his entire career on something he found deeply, fundamentally boring. He told me he became an engineer because his father was an engineer, and his grandfather was an engineer. And nobody in his family had ever asked him what he actually wanted to do. He wanted to open a bookstore. A tiny, dusty, beautiful bookstore in a small town where nobody would ask him to calculate anything ever again. I sat there, coffee growing cold, completely captivated by this strange, contradictory man who had just confessed his deepest secret to a total stranger. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, I started dreaming about what it would be like to build a life with someone so unexpected. But here's what I didn't know then, and what would take me years to understand: the dream of a small-town bookstore and my dream of teaching English to immigrant students in a bustling city were not just different. They were incompatible. And by the time I realized that, I was already in love with a man who wanted the opposite of everything I wanted. Psychologists call it cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort of holding two conflicting beliefs. But nobody warns you that love can create cognitive dissonance too. That your heart can want someone while your mind screams that it will never work. And that the longer you ignore that scream, the louder it gets. He stood up to leave, smiled at me, and said something I would replay in my head for years: "You know, I think you're the first person I've ever told that to." And I smiled back and said, "I think you're the first person who has ever told me something I'll never forget." That was the beginning. And also, somehow, the beginning of the end. Because the dream he shared with me that day wasn't just a bookstore, it was a whole life. A life in a small town. A life away from noise, away from people, away from everything I had worked so hard to build. The city versus the country. Have you ever had an argument that started about something completely meaningless, like what to have for dinner, and somehow ended with you questioning your entire relationship? That's exactly what happened the night Marcus and I had our first real fight about where to live. It started with a simple question: do you want pizza or Thai food? And somehow, within 30 minutes, we were yelling about houses and commutes, and whether it was even possible for two people who wanted completely different lives to stay together. I wanted the city. I wanted the energy, the diversity, the constant hum of possibility that came from living in a place where everything was accessible. Marcus wanted the country. He wanted quiet, space, a backyard where he could grow vegetables and read books without hearing sirens every 5 minutes. The city felt like home to me. The country felt like exile. To him, it was exactly the opposite. And the more we talked about it, the more I realized we weren't just arguing about a place to live, we were arguing about who we were as people. I had spent years building my career teaching English to immigrant students, working with people who came from all over the world, helping them find their voice in a new language. That work was my purpose. It required the city, the diversity, the need, the constant flow of new faces and new stories. Marcus didn't understand that. He thought I could teach anywhere. He didn't realize that my students weren't just students, they were my community, my reason for staying. My proof that I had made a difference in this country. To him, a job was a job. To me, it was a calling. That night, I said something I immediately regretted. I told him his dream of a bookstore was a fantasy, that small towns were dying, that nobody bought physical books anymore. It wasn't true. I knew it wasn't true even as I said it. But I wanted to hurt him the way his words were hurting me. And it worked. The look on his face, that crushed, confused, wounded look, I still see it sometimes when I close my eyes. He didn't yell back. He just stood up, walked out of the apartment, and didn't come home until the next morning. That's the thing about arguments in relationships. They're never really about the thing you're fighting about. They're about fear. About the terror that the person you love doesn't actually want the same future you do. About the sinking realization that love might not be enough to bridge the gap between two different dreams. I spent that night alone in our apartment, staring at the walls, replaying every word. And I realized something terrifying. We had been avoiding this conversation for years. And now that we finally had it, I wasn't sure we could survive it. But I also knew something else. I knew that I loved him. And that love was worth at least one more conversation. One more attempt to find common ground. I just had to figure out how to have it without destroying us in the process. His promotion, my sacrifice. I will never forget the day Marcus came home with the biggest smile I had ever seen on his face, and the moment I realized that smile meant the end of something I wasn't ready to lose. He had gotten the promotion. The one in Texas. The one he had been working toward for 3 years, the one that would double his salary and give him the title he deserved. He was so happy. So proud. So completely oblivious to the fact that his joy was about to become my nightmare. I wanted to be happy for him. I really did. But as he hugged me and spun me around our tiny apartment, all I could think about was my classroom, my students. The community I had spent years building from nothing. I thought about Maria. The Venezuelan woman who had come to my class barely able to say hello and was now writing essays about her children's future. I thought about Jamal, the Syrian refugee who had never held a book before and now couldn't stop reading. I thought about all of them, and I realized I couldn't leave them. I couldn't abandon the work that had given my life meaning. But I also couldn't ask Marcus to give up his dream. That would be selfish. That would be cruel. That would be the kind of thing that builds resentment so slowly you don't even notice it until it's too late. So I did what I always did when I was scared. I smiled. I said congratulations. And I buried my feelings so deep they wouldn't see the light of day for months. That night, while Marcus slept peacefully next to me, I lay awake and cried silently into my pillow. Asking myself the question I had been avoiding for years, is love supposed to feel this much like sacrifice? Psychologists call it self-silencing, the tendency to suppress your own needs and desires to maintain a relationship. And studies show it's one of the fastest ways to destroy a marriage. When one person constantly sacrifices their dreams for the other, the relationship becomes unbalanced. The giver grows resentful. The receiver feels guilty. And eventually, neither person ends up happy. I didn't know that then. I just knew that I was drowning in a silence I had created myself. For the next 3 weeks, I went through the motions. I helped Marcus plan the move. I researched schools in Texas. I told myself I could start over, that I could teach anywhere, that my students would be fine without me. But every night, alone in the kitchen, I would stare at the wall and feel pieces of myself slowly disappearing. And then one night, Marcus found me there. He saw the empty look in my eyes, the tears I couldn't hide, and he asked a question I wasn't ready to answer. Why do I feel like I'm losing you? I opened my mouth to lie again, to say everything was fine, but for the first time in years, I told him the truth. The unspoken resentment. Have you ever had a conversation with someone where every single word is fine? But the air between you is so thick with unspoken things that you can barely breathe? That became our new normal. Marcus and I stopped fighting about big things like Texas and careers and future dreams. We started fighting about everything else. He left his socks on the floor. I felt like he was disrespecting everything I did for our home. I took too long at the grocery store. He accused me of avoiding him. We were like two people speaking different languages, even though we both spoke English perfectly. The real language we had forgotten was honesty. Every small argument was just a symptom of the disease we refused to name. We were both resentful, both hurt. Both convinced we were the one making sacrifices while the other got everything they wanted. I started keeping score in my head, and I know he did too. I counted how many times I smiled when I wanted to scream. He counted how many times I said it's fine when we both knew it wasn't. We were building a wall between us, brick by brick, each brick carefully crafted from all the things we were too scared to say out loud. Research shows that unresolved resentment is one of the strongest predictors of divorce. It's not the big fights that destroy marriages. It's the slow, quiet accumulation of unexpressed grievances. And we were experts at that. One night, after a particularly brutal argument about something as stupid as how to load the dishwasher, I went into the bathroom, locked the door, and just sat on the floor. I thought about who I used to be before Marcus, the woman who didn't second-guess herself, the woman who spoke her mind without fear of consequences. And I didn't recognize her anymore. I had become a person who measured every word, who calculated every reaction, who was terrified of saying the wrong thing and starting another avalanche. Marcus knocked on the door. Not aggressively, but softly, almost apologetically. And he said something I didn't expect. I don't want to lose you. But I don't know how to stop this. I unlocked the door. We sat on the bathroom floor together, two people who loved each other but had somehow become strangers. And I asked him the question I had been avoiding for months. Do you even remember why you fell in love with me? He stared at me for a long moment, and then he said something that shattered me. I fell in love with the woman who wasn't afraid to tell me I was wrong. And I don't know where she went. That was when I realized the truth. I had spent so long trying to save our marriage that I had lost myself in the process. And without myself, there was nothing left for him to love. The therapist who saved us. I had never been to therapy before, and honestly, I thought it was for people who had given up on fixing things themselves. But the day we sat in Dr. Chen's office, clutching divorce papers we hadn't signed yet, I realized we had already given up. We were just too stubborn to admit it. She was a small woman with kind eyes and a way of looking at you that made you feel completely seen, completely vulnerable. And somehow okay with both of those things. She asked us one question that I still think about to this day. What did you love about each other when you first met? I froze. I had been so focused on everything that was broken that I had forgotten what was beautiful in the first place. Marcus spoke first. He talked about my laugh, the way I had laughed at him in that coffee shop when he told me he was an engineer who hated numbers. He talked about how I made him feel like it was okay to want something different from what his family expected. And then it was my turn. I talked about his hands, the way he doodled landscapes in the margins of his engineering notebooks, and how I knew from the very first conversation that he was more than just a man who solved problems. He was a man who dreamed. And somewhere along the way, we had stopped seeing those parts of each other. We had started seeing only the obstacles, the differences, the things we were fighting about. Dr. Chen asked us something else that changed everything. Are you fighting for your dream or against your partner's dream? That question hit me like a truck. I realized I wasn't fighting against Marcus's dream. I was fighting against the fear that his dream meant the death of mine. And he was doing exactly the same thing. We weren't enemies. We were just two scared people who had forgotten how to share their fears instead of weaponizing them. She gave us a simple exercise that sounded ridiculous at first. For 1 week, we couldn't say I want or I need in any conversation. We could only say we want or we need. It was harder than it sounds. Every single time I started to say I can't leave my students, I had to stop and reframe it as we need to figure out how to honor both of our commitments. And every time Marcus started to say I need that promotion, he had to say we need a plan that supports both of our futures. It felt forced. It felt fake. But something strange happened by the end of the first week. I stopped seeing him as the enemy of my dreams. And I started seeing him as my partner in building something new. That shift wasn't magic. It was just a reminder of something we had both forgotten. We were on the same team. Dr. Chen looked at us after that week and said something I will never forget. When love becomes a silent war, the first step to peace is remembering who your enemy actually is. It's not each other. It's the fear that you can't have both. And that, right there, was the moment I realized I had been fighting the wrong person all along. Learning each other's language. I used to think that Marcus and I spoke the same language, English, obviously, with all its complicated grammar and endless vocabulary. But sitting in Dr. Chen's office, I realized we had been speaking completely different languages the entire time. He spoke the language of logic. If we move to Texas, we make more money, we buy a house, we have a stable future. I spoke the language of meaning. If I leave my students, I lose my purpose, I lose myself, I lose the thing that makes me feel alive. And neither of us knew how to translate our words into something the other could actually understand. Dr. Chin gave us another assignment, and this one felt even more ridiculous than the first. We had to write each other a letter, but not in English. Not in any real language. We had to draw it. We had to communicate our deepest fears and hopes using only pictures, symbols, and stick figures. I thought it was the stupidest thing I had ever heard. But I did it anyway. I drew myself standing in a classroom with all my students, and then I drew a giant wall separating me from Marcus. And then I drew myself crying on one side of the wall while he stood on the other. It was messy, childish, completely embarrassing. But when I handed it to Marcus and watched him study it, something shifted. He wasn't reading my words. He was seeing my fear. He looked up at me with tears in his eyes and said, "I didn't know you felt so alone." And I realized that all the conversations we had failed at, all the arguments, all the silences, all the carefully worded sentences that somehow always came out wrong, they had all failed because words were too easy to misunderstand. Pictures weren't. Pictures were honest. Marcus drew his own picture, a tiny bookstore in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees and silence, and then he drew himself sitting inside. Completely alone, holding a book and crying. He told me the bookstore wasn't just a dream, it was his escape. His whole life, he had been surrounded by people telling him what to do, what to be, what to want. The bookstore was the first thing he had ever chosen for himself. And the thought of losing it, of giving it up just to make me happy, was breaking him in ways he couldn't put into words. That night, for the first time in years, I didn't try to solve anything. I didn't try to fix it or convince him or win the argument. I just held him, and he held me, and we both cried for all the things we had been too scared to say. Because that's what love actually is, not the absence of conflict, but the willingness to sit in someone else's pain and not run away from it. And in that moment, I understood something that would change our marriage forever. Love doesn't require us to have the same dreams. It just requires us to care about each other's dreams as much as we care about our own. The compromise that changed everything. The compromise didn't come from some grand revelation or a dramatic speech. It came from a napkin, a pen, and the realization that we had been thinking about this all wrong. Dr. Chen had given us one final assignment before we left her office. Draw a map of your ideal life, and then draw a map of your partner's ideal life. And then find the place where those two maps overlap. I thought it was another exercise in futility, but I did it anyway. I drew my map with the city at the center, my classroom, my students, my community. Marcus drew his map with a small town, a bookstore, trees, and silence. And when we placed them side by side, they looked completely different, two separate worlds with nothing in common. But then Marcus did something unexpected. He took his pen and started drawing roads. He connected my city to his small town, and then he drew a dot right in the middle of the distance between them. He said, "What if we don't have to choose? What if we find a place that's close enough to your city that you can commute, but far enough from the noise that I can have my bookstore?" I stared at that, like it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't perfect. But it was the first thing that felt possible. For the next month, we did something we had never done before. We researched together. Instead of fighting about Texas versus California, we looked at places in between. We found a small town 2 hours outside the city, a place with cheap rent, a quiet main street, and exactly one empty storefront that could become Marcus's bookstore. We visited it on a rainy Saturday, and I watched Marcus's face light up like a child on Christmas morning. He walked around that empty space, measuring walls with his hands, already imagining where the shelves would go. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was losing something. I felt like we were building something. The commute would be long. 2 hours each way, 3 times a week. But I realized that I didn't need to be in the city every single day. I could teach hybrid classes. I could work from home. I could build a new schedule that honored both my career and our relationship. And Marcus, my beautiful Marcus, looked at me that day and said something I will never forget. I would wait 10 years for this bookstore if it meant I got to wait with you. That's when I understood that compromise isn't about giving up your dream, it's about finding a new dream that belongs to both of you. It's about being brave enough to let go of perfect so you can hold on to something real. We signed the lease on that storefront 2 weeks later. And we drove home that night, hand in hand. Knowing we had just done something we never thought possible, we had saved our marriage by refusing to choose between our dreams. Building a new dream together. The first day we opened the bookstore, exactly 3 people walked in. One of them was a lost tourist looking for the bathroom. One was a teenager who clearly had no money and just wanted to escape the rain. And the third was an elderly woman who bought a used romance novel for $2 and told Marcus he had good energy. 3 people. That was it. And you know what? Marcus was the happiest I had ever seen him. He spent the entire day arranging books, dusting shelves, and smiling at every single person who walked through that door like they were the most important guest in the world. And I sat in the corner with my laptop, grading papers from my hybrid classes, watching him fall in love with his dream in real time. It wasn't perfect. The rent was barely covered, the heater made strange noises, and the coffee machine Marcus had bought secondhand broke on the 3rd day. But it was ours. And that made all the difference. For the next few months, we settled into a rhythm that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. I commuted to the city 3 days a week, teaching my classes and meeting with my students, and the other 4 days I worked from the bookstore, grading papers at a tiny table in the back while Marcus curated his collection of used books and built relationships with the community. The commute was exhausting. I won't lie. There were mornings when I wanted to cry just looking at the highway, mornings when I asked myself why I couldn't just find a job closer to home. But then I would walk into my classroom and see my students, and I would remember why I made this choice. And then I would drive back home, walk into that little bookstore, and see Marcus's face light up when I walked through the door. He started hosting community reading nights on Thursdays. Local families came, children sat on the floor with picture books, and older folks gathered in the corner to discuss novels they had read decades ago. It became more than a bookstore, it became a community, a place where people felt seen and heard. And Marcus, my beautiful Marcus, was at the center of it all, thriving in a way I had never seen him thrive before. One night, after a particularly successful reading event, we were closing up the shop and he turned to me with tears in his eyes. He said, "I didn't know it could feel like this. I didn't know a dream could feel this good." And I realized something profound. We had stopped fighting for our individual dreams and started building something together. The bookstore wasn't his dream anymore. It was our dream. And my teaching wasn't my dream anymore. It was our mission. We had found a way to hold both, to honor both, to let both of them grow side by side. And in doing so, we had built a life that belonged to both of us, not one of us sacrificing for the other, but both of us building something bigger than ourselves. What love actually means. I'm sitting in our tiny bookstore on a rainy Saturday afternoon, watching Marcus rearrange the shelves for the third time this week. And I realize something I never expected. I am happier than I have ever been. Not because everything is perfect. The rent is still tight, the commute is still long, and some days I still wonder if we made the right choice. But happiness, I've learned, isn't about perfection. It's about peace. It's about waking up next to someone who knows your flaws and loves you anyway. It's about building a life that doesn't require you to sacrifice who you are. Marcus walks over with a cup of tea, hands it to me with that familiar smile, and asks, "What are you thinking about?" And I tell him the truth. I tell him I'm thinking about how we almost lost everything because we forgot that love isn't about having the same dreams, it's about caring enough to dream together. It's about being brave enough to say, "I don't have all the answers, but I want to find them with you." Our journey wasn't easy. There were moments when I wanted to give up, moments when I convinced myself that love wasn't enough, that our differences were too big, that we were too different to ever make it work. But here's the thing about differences, they don't have to be obstacles. They can be strengths. When I think about our life now, I see two people who brought completely different gifts to the table. Marcus taught me how to slow down, how to appreciate silence, how to find joy in small things. And I taught him how to connect, how to build community, how to let people in. Together, we built something neither of us could have built alone. That's what love actually means. It's not about finding someone who wants the exact same things you want. It's about finding someone who makes you want to become a better version of yourself. It's about being willing to grow, to change, to compromise, not because you're giving up, but because you're choosing to build something new. Dr. Chin once told us, "The strongest marriages aren't the ones where both people agree on everything. They're the ones where both people are willing to keep showing up, even when it's hard." And we did. We kept showing up. Through the arguments, through the silences, through the fear and the doubt and the exhaustion. We kept choosing each other. And that choice, that daily, imperfect, beautiful choice, is what saved us. If you're watching this and you're struggling in your relationship, if you feel like your dreams are pulling you apart, I want you to know something. It doesn't have to end. You don't have to choose between love and your dreams. You just have to be brave enough to imagine a future that includes both. So tonight, when Marcus closes the bookstore and we walk home together under the streetlights, I'll hold his hand like I used to when we first met. And I'll remember that the American dream I was chasing wasn't about a house or a career, it was about this. About finding someone who sees you, really sees you, and chooses you anyway. Different dreams didn't break us. They made us stronger. And I wouldn't trade a single moment of it. That's all for today. I'll make more videos like this in the future. Please subscribe to watch.